Hey gang, Eric Whitacre here. I'm here at Spitfire Studios in London, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about writing for choir, why I think it's so important, my own inspirations for writing for choir, and then at the end of the video we'll kind of do a dissection of the piece Deep Field that I recently wrote. I wasn't always a choir guy. In fact, I started as a pop guy, pop and rock. This was all through high school. I didn't read music. I played synthesizers. I was obsessed with composers like Jean-Michel Jarre, bands like Kraftwerk. When I discovered Depeche Mode, that's really what I thought I would do, is just be in Depeche Mode. I still would like to be in Depeche Mode. And it wasn't until I was 18 that I joined a choir at university and had my life totally changed. And I think looking back on it, it was, first, I'd never really heard counterpoint. I didn't grow up with classical music, and so maybe if I'd heard it in film, I'd say a John Williams score somewhere, I didn't really know what it was. But in a choir, you actually experience counterpoint in 3 dimensions. The first piece I ever sang was the Requiem by Mozart, and I remember just hearing the lines around me, hearing the altos here, sopranos here, and being in the middle of this fugue, and something carried through with me, which has carried through my whole life, which is a visceral experience to music. I remember thinking, I had no idea that classical music, that kind of writing, could have the body feeling that I would get from pop and rock music. And that was the first time I'd ever experienced that. And then as I sang in choir over the year and over the next couple of years, it got more refined. And what I started to realize that it was the sound of the human voice, these dissonances, these close harmonies together, that would give me these feelings. I would feel them really in my gut, in my body, my heart. And when I started composing my own music, that's where I went to. At first were just these dissonances that made me feel like I'd never felt before. A good example of that is the first chord for Cloudburst, which is the second piece that I wrote. So it's a 7-note chord. It's basically the 3rd through the 10th partials of the overtone series on a D. But when sung in close harmony like this, something about the way the voices blend. I've heard this now with strings, this exact chord with strings, with brass, with synthesizers. It's all cool, but there's something about the richness of the overtone series made by voices that creates this shimmering cloud of sound that to me is unlike any other instrument. And as I compose for choir, that's it. That's the core philosophy I have is how can I create an emotional language that can be transferred from the sound of those voices over to the listener. So when I compose for choir, it's all about finding these emotional moments. And early on, I realized that it wasn't just about making myself feel, just feel in general, that each of these close harmonies or these clusters had a very specific emotional feeling. So for instance, in A Boy and a Girl, there's a chord. That simple chord, which is really just a F major chord with a bunch of added notes on it, it sounds to me like there's a melancholy to it, but it's got a sparkle of hope on top of it. And it's essential for the piece, in A Boy and a Girl. The poetry talks very specifically about love and loss. And so as a way to paint musically those words and those concepts, I'm always looking for those combinations of harmony, very specific, that make it shimmer emotionally. There might be something else, like for instance, later on we'll talk about it in Deep Field, but the big chord that is the climax of the piece is basically. the sound of that then is perfect for deep field and painting this sense of wonder and awe, this kind of almost fearful majesty of looking into the night sky and realizing there's billions of galaxies surrounding us. And so my approach to writing is very much about finding these emotional moments. And with choir, you can do all kinds of things like that, where you've got something super simple. The beginning of Luxa Rumque, for instance. It just begins with a simple minor triad, right? And then we add that, the top note here, and then just split half the choir. They move. I find in a way it's an invitation as well, and somehow voices do this really better than anything. I think it has partly to do with the fact that it's, I'm not a religious man, but I remember hearing the voice described as the only instrument made by God. I always loved that. I love just the idea that the instrument itself is our bodies, and there's something so primitive about that. That then I think when you hear voices in a way, it draws you in really like very few instruments can. I've had my own choir here in London now for, wow, I guess it's almost 8 or 9 years. And really these singers, they're some of the best musicians in the world. I love working with them. And also they're all friends. I know them really well. We've toured together. We've made music together for this time. And it was extraordinary making the library with Spitfire, because here we are in Air Studios, and it's all these people I know so well. It's amazing. When I listen back to the library, I can hear the individual voices. Not that they're sticking out. They would kill me for saying that. They're perfectly blended. But I can hear, so for instance, the 6 sopranos, I can hear all 6 of those voices. I know these people so well. And so when we were making the EVOs in the library, we wanted to try to capture that, these very specific performances. Here's an example of one of them. I love this. So I can hear all the altos, I can hear the tenors in there. You hear the tenors really at the top of their bright range there. What I love about something like this, just as a point of departure in composition, this is something too that choirs do really well. Strings do in a different way also well, but choirs, there's something beautiful about it, where you can basically put a little box, right? So you say, these notes, these notes, sing them at your own tempo, independent from everybody else. And what it will create is kind of a diffuse cloud of sound. You hear some of the individual voices, but you also get this kind of echoey stuff behind it. And what I love about it in terms of the writing process is you sit down, you're blocked, you don't know what to do, and then you just push that single note, and it immediately takes you to an entire world, and something that I wouldn't normally expect, right? So it's like, boom, okay, I'm there. What can I build on? Those 2 notes are emotive. How do I use that somewhere else? And with something like the Evo, you can then stack the voices. Beautiful, isn't it? It's this, again, it's this invitation into this mystical world that fast. And when I'm writing, I love the idea to just pull up a sample like that, just play for a moment, and also to remind myself, I don't know if any of you are like this, but as a composer, I can really get into my head. If I got Stravinsky sitting on one shoulder and Bach sitting on the other, they're always going to be better composers than I can ever dream of being, even on their worst days. And I can get judgmental, and it can become about notes and relationships and all of this stuff. And the moment I go back to what does it sound like, I'm 14 years old again, and it's just the sounds around me. Oh, how can I manipulate that? And how can I make my own thing? How can I build my own little garden? So within the sample library, there's literally thousands of possibilities, if not infinite possibilities, with the EVOs. You can just combine and find all of these different colors and things that we did in the studio that can subtly be shifted for your own writing and for your own inspiration. Just give you an example. This is one called Dynamic Movements. I love this because it's super simple and very subtle. So if you listen, they start on a very closed vowel, almost a hum, and they're slowly swelling, little dynamic, open their mouths a little bit, come back down. So even just on a minor chord like this, I find this infinitely useful. Also because it's the way the evolution works, it completely captures my attention and the listener's attention. It's like, where is this going? Where does it evolve? And it's so subtle. We were in the studio and the first always is with the breath. So boom, then we start. And then I would just give them a little this, a little this, a little this. It's also amazing with these singers. It's I use the analogy often, but it's like driving a Ferrari. Just the tiniest movement on the wheel will take you in a big direction. So it's just very, very subtle. Maybe the turn of a hand or my fingertips. And then what I love with an Evo like this is so you can then start to make it a little more complex. If you start with a minor chord like this, and then as that starts to evolve, could go on and on. Like a piece just starts to write itself with these Evos. And if it's not a piece itself, then at least it's a color, it's an idea. Oh, you know what? That is really useful. That's something that I'm definitely going to be able to use later on. And then within the main library are these simple, very pure choral expressions. This breathy ooh that we use in the mock-up of Deep Field later on. My God, it's just transcendent. You hear? Do you hear the breath in there? And this was a very specific technique. I remember recording this with them, and so it's a pure ooh, no vibrato, and then just the tiniest bit of air. What I find with something like that is it's so human, right? I really don't know any other instruments that is this intimate. You hear it's like someone singing and whispering in your ear at the same time. And I don't know if you're getting this when you're listening to the video, but here in the room, it's the frizzen up and down my neck. I could listen to this all day. I have to say too, when I'm composing, usually my best moments are when it's not that I'm falling in love with my own music, but that I'm falling in love with the sound, with music in general. And this is the kind of thing that I could just sit, really for hours and just be with. The lovely thing too about these libraries, different than the choir itself, is on a very pragmatic level. If you've got the altos and sopranos singing a major third like this, and then you add, what happens with an actual choir is half of those singers that are singing the major third have to move away and jump down this way. And what that means in real terms is if you have 5 altos and 6 sopranos like we have, then you lose half of them on that sustaining note. Now, it's not that it gets weaker, it just becomes, it's a different sound. And what's great with the Evo is when you split, it's still the same number of voices on every one of those notes, and then you can continue later, further down with that. So now essentially you've got 80 people singing at the quietest, most intimate level. Yeah, I could listen to this for all day. Another sound from the choir library itself, the main choir library, is this tutti all ah. So they're all singing ahs at the same time. And I love this also because so first, it's amazing to me the palette of colors available to you with singers. There are really very few instruments that you hear the hum, the ooh, an open vowel like this ah, where it's this way, and it's a completely different instrument. Also, it totally changes the overtones that are resonating on top of this. And I especially like this patch because it's sort of got built into it, this 9-second cathedral reverb. And so that you can do these kind of washes. Yeah, it's nice, and it's this patch, for instance, I find particularly useful because there's something a choir does when they just open up, and you get to hear them in the top of their register, really. By the way, I should say, if any of you composer nerds out there are interested in this at all, I know as a composer nerd, I would be myself, is that in general, the way I voice a choir is that I start with a lot of space on the bottom. It looks just like the overtone series. A lot of space on the bottom, and then it gets closer harmonies as you go higher up in the registers. So for instance, that kind of thing, I'd give like a 10th. This is a typical voicing I would have. So the fundamental, the 5th, and then the 3rd, nice and open like that. And then I'd start to bring in the closer harmonies. And what's great about this too, especially when using the sample libraries, this is very much the way that you can effectively voice an acoustic choir. If you're writing for an acoustic choir in general, it gives a shimmer to it. Also gives a strong foundation to the chord. You hear that, you know what the overtone series is supposed to be, especially when they're singing straight tone like this. And then you can fill in the gaps with all of those chords up there. And you can get, pretty complex stuff going if you've got this and then. It's beautiful too with the swells like that, right? Because then you hear, if you hit them at slightly different times, then you get the voices sort of coming out of the texture, pulling back in the texture. It's a good 30 seconds of a piece. That's a nice foundation. I found early on when I started composing music that I'd have that classic terrifying moment in front of a blank piece of manuscript that I had no idea what to do, that any notes that I would start to write sounded like they'd been done before, they were cliche, they were something I'd done before. And so what I started to do was draw what I call the emotional architecture. I would draw on a piece of paper with pencil, just simple pencil, the emotional journey that I want the audience and the musicians to take as the piece is unfolding. And I have no problem writing, I want it to make me feel like that moment in Debussy or that Thomas Newman moment. That's how it should feel, or maybe sound a little bit like that. And it can be murky, I can use all these adjectives, but just try to draw the experience, where the climax will be, how this piece will unfold for the audience and for the musicians. With Deep Field, as I sat down to start to write this, I was struck by the story of the Hubble telescope. And that is that when they first got the telescope into space, it didn't work the way it was planned to. They opened up the lens, they realized that all of the images coming back were blurry. And now you've got the most expensive and complex machine ever built in space. And how do you fix this? So they NASA did what they always do. They just rolled up their sleeves, got up there, and they essentially put a contact lens on the Hubble telescope. And then for the first time, these images started coming back. And when they took the deep field image, which was to earthbound telescopes a completely black area of the sky, there was literally nothing there. And they left the exposure open for 11 days, 384 separate exposures, I think. That's when we first saw that there were, in this tiny little sliver of the sky, these 3,000 galaxies, not stars, but galaxies, each one filled with hundreds of billions of their own stars. That was all of the inspiration. But when I sat down to sketch this thing, I was struck by that moment, this idea that the music, or that the images were out of focus and then almost in focus, and out of focus and in focus. I think what I'm always looking for is these visual or dramatic elements that then can be somehow painted musically. And that's a beautiful way to think about a musical motive, is that it's out of focus, and then it's almost in focus. And then it's out of focus, and it's almost in focus. And that's what I did when I wrote Deep Field. So once I had the big sketch of Deep Field, you can see here where it's terraced, it starts small, and it grows, and it grows, and it grows. There's this massive climax, which is this chord. Just this epic chord. That's the first time where you can see right there where it's going to be in focus, and then it comes back down. I knew then that I needed what I call the golden brick, which is a small melodic fragment that somehow carries all the DNA of the entire piece in it. So I made this sketch, and you can see in this sketch that the shape of it is exactly the same as the full piece. So on the micro level, this single melody, it echoes the macro level. All of this, by the way, was just a way of me echoing the grandeur and wonder of space itself, and how on every single level there seems to be these governing principles. So there in that simple melody, I knew that it was going to tell the story in that melody of NASA's journey getting this telescope into space and working. So the first three notes I wrote. Very simple, and that's the idea of failure, that initial failure. So 3 descending notes. Then the idea being there that now you hear it's a lift, this longing, this challenge, and then again a fall. And then finally, we get up, up, the achievement, and then the last 4 notes are the same as the first 3 notes. But now they're transformed by the journey, so that there's a sense of catharsis. So all of that is built into the piece. And then for the first 16 minutes, 17 minutes of Deep Field, it's all orchestral. There's no choir like this at all. It's all orchestral, and it only uses those 4 motives, those little cells. Every note in the piece is somehow an echo of that. And the idea is that it flirts with being in focus, but it's always out of focus. It's nearly in focus, it's almost out of focus. So you hear just endless variations and clouds on those themes being deconstructed, and super simple. I knew I needed a super simple melody because I was going to do all of this stuff to it. But then, once we get the climax and the Deep Field image is revealed, and it comes down and there's this final ending hymn, that's when the choir comes in. And that's the first time that you hear that melody complete in focus. We've made a little mock-up of the end of Deep Field, the part where the choir finally enters. And we've made it with the Eric Whitacre Choir sample library. Let's just play from the moment that you hear that full melody for the first time in focus. Just incredibly simple. You can see the library here working, the automation of the performance and of the volume. There's the third part of that melody. I love the yum. You hear the in the sample, you can hear that legato movement. So nice, so natural. And then the moment when the entire choir enters, that's that catharsis that we hear at the end of the melody. So musical. If you want to hear the rest of this piece, then we'll put a link to it right below the video. It's online now, and it's in a super interesting way. There's not only can you see the film that we made with 59 Productions here in London and the Space Telescope Science Institute using all of this imagery from NASA and from the Hubble telescope, but we also, in the filmed version, we used a virtual choir. There's over 8,000 people from 120 countries joining in to sing this bit here at the end. I highly recommend listening on the best audio system you possibly have on the biggest screen possible when you go and experience it. I hope that all of this gives you just something to think about. All of you composers out there, think first that you might consider writing for voice. Like I said, I didn't even know about it. I didn't know its possibilities. And now I'm such a convert. I feel that vocal writing, it can capture the soul in a way that really no other instrument can. And it communicates terabytes of emotional information, just a direct line to the heart. I know it's been my whole life. It's been my vocation, is to work with voices and to write for them. And this Spitfire sample library, I think, is such a beautiful tool for exploring the possibilities there. Doesn't matter what kind of composer you are. If you're an acoustic composer, writing concert music, this is a great tool to try things out and see what might work and to inspire you. And if you're a composer from media, it's, my God, the possibilities, I think, are endless and are really rarely used. It feels like most of the time you hear choirs used as, they double the orchestra, or they're angels somewhere singing in the distance, or it's the end of the apocalypse. But the truth is there are these just infinite, interesting emotional colors, I think, that could find their way into all kinds of scenes or video game action. More than anything, what I hope for you and what I hoped when I was making the library is that it will inspire, that it might just knock loose something in your mind and in your hearts that gives you a path into writing something original and something authentic. Good luck, everybody.